In 1967, at the American logistical hub of Nui Dat, in the heart of Phuoc Tuy province, there was a standing order passed down to every incoming United States soldier that sounded more like a dark superstition than a military regulation. It was a command that defied the logic of conventional warfare, yet it was whispered with a chilling gravity that left no room for jokes. The order was simple. If you see an Australian rucksack lying on the ground, walk away. Do not ask questions. Do not investigate. And whatever you do, never, under any circumstances, touch it. The American Marines, men who had seen the worst of Hue and Khe Sanh, looked at the Australians with a mixture of bewilderment and deep-seated unease. They called them the jungle hobos, or the ghosts of the red dirt. These men didn't look like soldiers of a modern queen. They looked like primal emanations of the forest itself. They smelled of rotting vegetation and fermented death. They hadn't felt the touch of soap in weeks, and they possessed a terrifying ability to vanish into the tree line while you were looking straight at them. But one young American crew chief, fresh from the States and brimming with helpful naivety, thought the legends were just exaggerated tall tales meant to scare the replacements. He spotted a dirty, sweat-stained canvas bag near the edge of a landing zone and thought to himself, how dangerous can a piece of gear really be? He reached down to help a comrade, as he thought. What he found inside wasn't food, nor was it extra ammunition. It was the physical manifestation of a philosophy of war so brutal and alien that it shattered his mind. It was proof that the Australians had stopped being soldiers long ago and had become something the Viet Cong feared more than the thunder of B-52 bombers. Today, we peel back the layers of this dark history to understand the truth of the Australian ghosts of the forest. Captain James Whitfield, a high-ranking officer in United States Army intelligence, first entered the Australian operational area during the peak of the monsoon season, when the world felt like it was dissolving into gray mud and green shadows. He arrived expecting to find the traditional military excellence associated with the British Commonwealth, sharp salutes, polished brass, and the orderly conduct of a professional army. Instead, the first thing that hit him was the smell. It wasn't just the scent of unwashed bodies, it was a thick, sentient reek that seemed to have its own heartbeat. It was the pungent, overwhelming aroma of Nuoc Mam fish sauce, mixed with the metallic tang of old sweat, the bitterness of hot peppers, and the cloying scent of damp earth. As he stood on the red laterite soil, 5 men emerged from the impenetrable wall of the jungle. They didn't walk, they flowed like liquid shadows. The secret to this nauseating stench was, in fact, the most sophisticated weapon in their arsenal. While the American military machine was spending billions of dollars ensuring its soldiers had lemon-scented soap, mint-flavored toothpaste, and fresh-smelling laundry, the Australians had realized a fundamental flaw in Western doctrine. The jungle is not just a place of sight and sound. It is a world governed by the sense of smell. To a Viet Cong guerrilla who had lived in the forest for years, an American soldier smelled like a neon sign. He smelled of Western chemicals, processed sugar, fragrant tobacco, and the artificial sense of a civilization that had no place in the bush. A trained scout could catch the bouquet of a United States platoon from hundreds of meters away, long before a single twig was snapped. The Australians chose to commit a form of biological treason. A week before departing on a long-range recon patrol, the operators of the Special Air Service Regiment would cease all hygiene. They threw away their soap and deodorant. Most importantly, they completely overhauled their internal chemistry. They stopped eating Western rations and began consuming only what the local partisans ate: rice, dried fish, and massive quantities of the fermented fish sauce known as Nuoc Mam. This sauce is made by layering fish and salt in wooden vats for months until it liquefies into a pungent, salty, amber fluid that smells like advanced decomposition. By saturating their systems with it, the Australians ensured that their very sweat smelled like the environment and the people who belonged there. They became olfactory ghosts. When they moved through the undergrowth, the jungle's natural alarms remained silent. The birds didn't scream, and the monkeys didn't chatter, because to the forest, these men didn't smell like invaders. They smelled like the forest floor itself. However, the smell was merely the foundation of their camouflage. To truly master the art of the hunt, the Australians reached back into the deepest history of their own continent. They integrated Aboriginal trackers into their training and operations, men whose ancestors had survived the harshest landscapes on Earth for 40,000 years. These trackers looked at the jungle not as a chaotic wall of green, but as a manuscript written in the finest detail. They taught the Special Air Service Regiment operators to read micro-signs that would be invisible to even the most veteran American Ranger. A single blade of grass bent against the grain meant a person had passed by. A tiny smear of mud on a leaf at shoulder height indicated the passage of a man carrying a heavy rucksack. The trackers could tell the weight of a man's load by the depth of his heel print and his state of mind by the length of his stride. Under this tutelage, the Australians learned to move at a pace that American commanders found agonizingly slow, sometimes covering only 300 meters in an entire hour. They would sit in total silence for half a day, letting the jungle's rhythms settle around. This brings us to the mystery of the rucksacks and the reason they were treated as sacred, lethal objects. For an Australian operator, his pack was not just a container for gear, it was a fortress and a final insurance policy. They knew that the Viet Cong were masters of scavenging and would often inspect any equipment left behind by retreating or resting forces. Consequently, the Australians turned their own supplies into weaponized traps. Every strap, every buckle, and every pocket of an Australian rucksack was often rigged with a hair-thin tripwire or a pressure-release trigger. Inside, they would conceal directional anti-personnel charges or grenades with the pins pulled, held in place only by the tension of the canvas. The young American crew chief who tried to help found this out the hard way. When he grabbed the strap of a seemingly abandoned bag to toss it into his Huey, he felt a sickening click. The resulting explosion was small but surgically precise, designed to maim anyone who dared to interfere with the gear. The Australian who owned the pack didn't offer an apology or even a word of comfort as the medic rushed in. He simply checked the rest of his rigging with a cold, mechanical detachment. In the harsh logic of the Australian Special Air Service, there was no such thing as an innocent touch. If you violated their space, you were a threat, and threats were dealt with by the cold math of explosives. This created a profound psychological rift between the Allies. The Americans began to view the Australians not as brothers in arms, but as a different species of predator, ones they were glad were on their side, but whom they never truly trusted. The true limits of this inhuman endurance were best illustrated by a mission that still haunts the classified annexes of military history, known as Operation Leech. The objective was the elimination of a high-value Viet Cong tax collector and intelligence officer who moved through the labyrinthine mangrove swamps of the Rucksack Special Zone. Instead of a conventional ambush from the banks, the Australian team decided to become the water itself. They entered the stagnant black sludge of the swamp and remained there, submerged up to their chins, for 72 consecutive hours. For 3 days and 3 nights, they stayed perfectly still in a toxic soup of human waste, rotting vegetation, and industrial runoff. They breathed through hollow reeds and modified snorkels, their heads hidden under clumps of swamp grass. To move was to die, so they did not move. They did not speak, they did not sleep, and they did not even flinch when the swamp began to feed on them. Hundreds of leeches, attracted by the warmth of their blood, attached themselves to every exposed inch of their skin. They crawled into their ears, under their eyelids, and into their nostrils. The men had to endure the sensation of these parasites bloating themselves on their lifeblood, knowing that a single splash to remove them would alert enemy river patrols. By the end of the 3rd day, a horrific process called maceration had begun to take hold. Their skin, soaked in the septic water, began to turn white and lose its structural integrity, literally sloughing off the muscle in wet gray sheets. They were decomposing while still breathing. When the target's boat finally glided past in the moonlight, the driftwood erupted. The violence was silent and absolute. They used only knives and garrots, pulling the enemy into the black water without a... The results of this terrifying dedication were reflected in the cold, hard data of the war, numbers that United States analysts in Saigon initially refused to believe. The average casualty exchange ratio for most American units in Vietnam was roughly 10 to 1. This was considered a success by the standards of the Pentagon's war of attrition. However, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment was producing a ratio of 500 to 1. For every one Australian life lost in the bush, 500 of the enemy were neutralized. This was not achieved through superior technology or overwhelming firepower. In fact, the Australians often carried less weight and fewer heavy weapons than their American counterparts. It was achieved through a fundamental shift in consciousness. The Americans fought a war of noise and fury, using B-52s to turn mountains into dust and napalm to strip the earth bare, trying to force the jungle to submit to their will. The Australians fought a war of silence and shadows, surrendering their ego and their comfort to the laws of the forest. They proved that in a conflict of shadows, the loudest gun doesn't win. The sharpest eye and the most patient heart do. The Viet Cong, who considered themselves the masters of the jungle, found themselves being stalked by something they couldn't see, smell, or hear. They began to tell stories of forest spirits that didn't bleed and didn't sleep. The psychological impact was so severe that some Viet Cong units were ordered to avoid any contact with __0_ at all costs, effectively ceding entire sectors of the forest to a few dozen Australians. But this level of mastery came with a price that no military medal could ever compensate for. Captain Whitfield, during his final days at the base, began to notice the hollowed-out nature of the men who returned from these long patrols. They didn't celebrate their victories. They didn't talk about home. They would sit in the shadows of the barracks, cleaning their knives with a rhythmic, obsessive intensity, their eyes constantly scanning the perimeter even in the safety of the base. They had developed a form of psychological dissociation that allowed them to survive the swamp and the leeches, but it also severed their connection to the civilized world. They had recalibrated their nervous systems to a frequency of constant, lethal crisis, and for many, there was no way to dial it back. When the war ended and they returned to the sun-drenched suburbs of Australia, the silence of civilian life became their new enemy. The sound of a car backfiring, the smell of fish at a market, or the sight of a thicket of trees in a park could trigger a flashback that lasted for hours. The Australian Special Air Service had one of the highest rates of post-service trauma and social displacement of any unit in the war. They had been optimized for an environment of absolute danger, and once removed from it, they found themselves broken and obsolete. Whitfield's final report to United States Army intelligence was a masterpiece of tactical analysis. He documented every detail of the Australian method, the scent camouflage, the patience of the trackers, the weaponized gear, and the psychological warfare. He argued that the American way of war was fundamentally flawed, and that they were losing because they refused to become what the jungle required. His report was thorough, it was brilliant, and it was utterly ignored. The Pentagon was too invested in its industrial model of warfare, the belief that enough bombs and enough money could solve any problem. To admit that a few hundred hobos in the woods were achieving better results than entire divisions would have been an admission of institutional failure. The report was filed away in a dusty cabinet and remained there for 40 years. It was only during the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan that modern special operations forces began to rediscover the lessons the Australians had mastered in 1967. They learned that technology is a tool, but it is not a substitute for the human spirit's ability to adapt and endure. On his last night at Nui Dat, Whitfield sat with the Australian sergeant who had first warned him about the rucksacks. The man was gaunt, his skin stained yellow from atabrine and malaria, but his hands were steady as he sharpened a small blade. Whitfield asked him if it was all worth it, the rot, the pain, the loss of their own humanity. The sergeant didn't look up. He simply reached into his pocket and produced a single playing card. the ace of spades, stained with a dark, brownish substance on the corner. He handed it to the American and said, "The war doesn't care what you want it to be. It only cares what you are willing to become. We became what was necessary." For the Americans, the war was a job to be finished. For the Australians, it was a transformation to be endured. They had crossed the line from fighting for something to becoming the very immune response of the jungle itself. They were the apex predators of a world that didn't want them, and they left a legacy of fear that still whispers through the Vietnamese forests to this day. When you look at the black granite wall in Washington, you see the names of 58,000 Americans who gave their lives in a war that couldn't be won by technology. But if you go to the quiet memorials in Canberra, you see the names of 521 Australians who achieved a tactical immortality by surrendering everything they were. And in that difference lies the entire history of the Vietnam War. Do not touch their packs. The ghosts are still watching, and the forest still remembers the smell of the Nuoc Mam and the silence of the Australian Special Air Service.